How many times have you heard that there are only two genders, male and female, and that human beings are a sexually dimorphic species? How can gender seem to be a concept based on biological sex, and yet also separate from biological sex? My name is Fermanaging Kim, and in this video I will look at the history of sex and gender. 99% of the human population is either biologically male or biologically female. The typical biological male has XY chromosomes, facial hair, a flat chest, a penis and testicles. The typical biological female has XX chromosomes, breasts, ovaries, a womb and a vagina. Because of the need for division of labour when we lived in the wild, nature also evolved certain characteristics for each of the sexes. Some of these are based in the effects of hormones, testosterone or estrogen, and some are sexually selected traits, traits that mates find desirable and thus begin to predominate in the gene pool. Testosterone can lead to greater aggressive and competitive tendencies and also to an increased sex drive or sexual appetite. Estrogen results in more nurturing and cooperative tendencies. Sexually selected traits include a tendency for males to be taller or more muscular and women to be curvier and smaller in stature. All of these evolved traits made sense in the wild when males needed to be the ones to hunt for food and protect the females and children, and females needed to work together in the home environment, bringing up the children and looking after the home environment. Then society happened. People settled down and started to farm the land. They built houses, they started wearing clothing. People owned land and wealth, which they would pass on to their children, and so bringing up children so they could inherit your wealth and land became very important. Add to this certain religious paranoia around sinful sexual practices, including sexual activity between people of the same biological sex, and a clothing code developed, a way that males and females could tell each other apart when wearing clothing. As society progressed, in some cultures, the paranoia around transgressions of sanctioned gender or sexuality norms meant that even more rigid codes were invented. This extended to behaviour now also, and so rigid and restrictive gender roles were created, which reached its peak around the Victorian era. Along with this rigid, restrictive form of gender came a hefty dose of sexism, and inequality between men and women. In this most restrictive manifestation of gender, men were supposed to be tough and independent and not show weakness or emotion. They were the breadwinners, and they held all the important, powerful roles in society. Women, meanwhile, were supposed to be sensitive, nurturing homemakers, to look pretty for their husbands, bring up the children, and did not hold any power or influence or earn money for themselves. All of these changes that occurred once human beings settled down and created societies are, of course, socially constructed, imposed on people to maintain the gender status quo. Some of the more extreme manifestations are straight up sexist by today's standards. Then something changed. Because we have settled down and no longer live in the wild, where life is physically challenging and dangerous, there is no longer a major need for men to be tough and aggressive. Sexual selections start to change. Women don't always seek tough, aggressive men, for example. Sometimes they seek gentle, sensitive men instead. And men don't necessarily always choose meek, submissive women, but sometimes want aggressive, dynamic women instead. Because of these changes, the sexual selection pressures have slackened, allowing for greater diversity of males and females to evolve. And as society has become more accepting of gay, lesbian and bisexual sexualities, it could also be argued that there is no longer a pressing need for men and women to dress and look differently. There also is no longer this inherited wealth thing, at least not as predominantly in society. As males and females have developed a more varied range of temperaments and expressions, the old stereotypes and rigid gender roles have loosened, and men and women no longer have to conform to expected social norms. Nature will create variety, unless there are selection pressures that make certain outcomes more advantageous for survival. Amongst the varieties that can occur, there seem to also be the possibility for the brain's body map to be in conflict with the biological sex of the body. Even if there is no other gender in the brain, there surely must be a body map in there. Amputees often get phantom limb syndrome. That's because the body map in the brain expects the amputated limb to still be there. It stands to reason that the brain also expects certain sex characteristics to be there. Some people, it seems, have a brain that is telling them they should have a different biological sex than the one they actually have. This results in those who desire to change their biological sex to what their brain is telling them they should have. Also, certain gender roles and expectations persist in modern society, things we assume men and women to be, but not everyone fits that. For some people, merely dressing differently is enough. For others, they just reject the obvious stereotypes. But some people can only feel comfortable identifying as the opposite gender or as no gender at all. Even the language we use to talk about people can be painfully restrictive to some people, so they choose to identify with other words and pronouns than the ones associated with their birth sex. Maybe in a future society we will loosen up our definitions and expectations of what men and women should be enough that people, whether biologically female or biologically male, can simply be themselves without a load of gendered baggage complicating that. There may still be those who wish to change their biological sex, however, but males and females will simply be males and females, and none of the rest of it will matter. Everyone will simply be free to be whatever they are, no matter what is between their legs. Or maybe we will always have gender, but there will simply be more choice for people as to which social category they wish to identify with, including opting out of the system and identifying some other way. But in the meantime, remember that many of these things are socially created, and even those that evolved are subject to change, as without selection pressure, nature tends towards variety anyway. And always, in a matter as sensitive as gender, remember to show compassion and be respectful to others no matter what their sex, gender expression or gender identity. Thanks for watching.